At the end of his legendary career, William Shakespeare brought to life one of his most iconic yet unusual plays. The Tempest is a haunting tale of shipwreck, mysterious islands, and survival. What many today don't realize is that this dramatic script was inspired by a remarkable real-life shipwreck that had gripped England just a few years earlier. In fact, Shakespeare even borrowed phrases and imagery from a survivor's vivid account of the terrifying ordeal. This is the true story of the Sea Venture, an English ship that set out to save a struggling Jamestown colony, but was thrown wildly off course by a violent storm and ended up somewhere much worse. The story begins on May 23, 1609, when King James I issued a new charter to the Virginia Company of London that officially endorsed a third supply mission to England's first American colony, Jamestown. Though Jamestown had been privately funded by the Virginia Company, a group of wealthy investors, they relied on royal support to provide legitimacy to their operation and attract more investment. The investors sought profits from New World resources like gold and tobacco, while King James saw strategic footholds in the Americas that could extend English influence and counter the quickly growing Spanish power there. However, the first 2 years did not go smoothly, and Jamestown was unfortunately teetering on the brink of collapse. Disease, starvation, and frequent conflicts with the Powhatan tribe had ravaged the settlement, and supplies were dangerously low even after 2 prior resupply missions. Desperate to protect their mutual interests, the Virginia Company and the English Crown viewed this fleet as Jamestown's last hope. To ensure the success of this critical mission, the Virginia Company assembled the largest fleet England had ever sent to the Americas, 9 ships led by the Sea Venture, the flagship and largest vessel in the group. The fleet would be led by the experienced Admiral Sir George Somers, along with Sir Thomas Gates, the new governor of Jamestown. And the 9 ships would also carry over 500 settlers, along with animals, tools, and enough supplies to help the colony survive for a year. The Virginia Company placed high hopes in the experienced leadership of Gates, believing his presence would bring stability, discipline, and renewed success to the struggling settlement. Their ship set sail from Plymouth on June 2, 1609, loaded with desperately needed supplies, including food, building materials, and weapons to bolster the colony's defenses against the natives. Unlike previous expeditions to the Americas, this resupply mission planned to follow a bold new route that could potentially cut weeks off the Atlantic crossing. Traditionally, English ships sailed south to the Canary Islands before turning west toward the Caribbean, then following the islands northward to the mainland. This course took advantage of calmer seas and favorable trade winds at this latitude, but it added weeks to the journey. A second English voyage, however, demonstrated the viability of a more direct route, west from the Azores, then onward to Bermuda, and finally across to the Chesapeake Bay. By bypassing the Caribbean, the English would avoid Spain's growing presence in the region. Although risking harsher weather conditions, this new path promised to save precious provisions and lessen the grueling time at sea. Admiral Sir George Somers was eager to test the new path, hoping it would allow them to deliver much-needed supplies before Jamestown's situation became even more dire. As the fleet pressed westward into the open Atlantic, the first weeks of the journey went smoothly. Their ships held their course, maintaining formation and making steady progress toward their planned stop in Bermuda. Spirits were high among the passengers and crew, thrilled by the prospect of a shorter voyage and the opportunity for a fresh start in the New World. On board, settlers spoke eagerly of the new lives that awaited them in Virginia, a place they hoped to own land, gain freedom, and find wealth in the land's untapped resources. But as they got deep into the middle of the Atlantic, ominous clouds began to form on the horizon. In late July, the fleet encountered a powerful hurricane that swept over them with ferocious winds and towering waves. The Sea Venture, carrying Admiral Somers and Governor Gates, took the brunt of the storm. For days, the ship was battered by relentless gales, its hull groaning under the pressure of the surging waves. As the hurricane raged, the crew of the Sea Venture fought tirelessly to keep the ship from sinking. Waves crashed over the deck, and the relentless winds tore at the sails, making it nearly impossible to steer. Water poured into the hold faster than the men could bail it out, and the ship's timber began to groan under the pressure. Admiral Somers, Governor Gates, and Captain Christopher Newport urged the crew and passengers to keep fighting, but it became clear that the ship was losing the battle against the storm. In a desperate attempt to prevent disaster, Somers ordered the ship to head toward a faint outline of land glimpsed through the mist. It was a mysterious chain of islands known in sailors' tales as the Isles of Devils, now known as Bermuda. Sailors spoke of these islands in hushed tones, sharing stories of strange lights, ghostly cries, and treacherous waters that lured ships to their doom. For the crew of the Sea Venture, there was no other choice. Facing certain death if they remained adrift, they aimed for the reefs, hoping the shallow waters would give them a chance to beach the ship and make it to dry land. At last, after hours of grueling struggle, the Sea Venture struck the reef, wedged against jagged rocks just off Bermuda's coast. The storm continued to batter the ship, but with the hull partially secured, the crew seized their chance to evacuate. They lowered the lifeboats into the churning waters and began to board all 140 men, 10 women, and 1 dog. From the site of the shipwreck, they paddled over a half-mile to the shore of Bermuda. Through the combined efforts of crew and passengers, every single soul on board made it to the safety of the beach. Exhausted and soaked, they found themselves marooned on this strange, uncharted island. As the storm subsided, the survivors gathered on the beach, bracing to encounter whatever horrors might await them on this Isle of Devils. But to their astonishment, Bermuda turned out to be far from the cursed place of legend they'd imagined. The island was lush and alive, offering abundant food and fresh water. Wild pigs roamed freely, and fruit-bearing trees provided a bounty to sustain them. Admiral Summers, Governor Gates, and Captain Newport immediately took charge, organizing groups to salvage what they could from the wrecked Sea Venture and establish a makeshift camp. What had begun as a place of dread quickly became their unlikely sanctuary. Over the weeks, the crew made repeated trips to the wreck to retrieve tools, timber, and provisions that had miraculously survived the crash. Meanwhile, they constructed shelters and gathered food, slowly building a small, temporary community on the island. Remarkably, even in the face of these new circumstances, Admiral Summers and Governor Thomas Gates felt compelled by their duty to complete the mission to save Jamestown. Admiral Summers and Governor Gates began to draft up an ambitious plan. If they could build new ships from the remains of the Sea Venture and Bermuda's resources, they might still reach Jamestown and deliver the crucial salvage supplies to the struggling colony. However, not all the survivors shared this vision. On the initial trip, many had heard grim stories from the crew about Jamestown's harsh conditions and were reluctant to risk the journey, arguing that the hurricane and shipwreck had severed their original contract. They believed that they could establish a new life on Bermuda, where food was abundant and survival seemed far more promising. Some even attempted to rebel, claiming that the shipwreck had released them from their obligations under Gates. In response, Gates imposed strict discipline, policing escape attempts and ensuring work continued on the construction of new vessels. Under Summers and Gates' leadership, the survivors began the daunting task of building 2 ships from the wreckage of the Sea Venture and the resources Bermuda offered. Using salvaged timbers, sails, and nails, they crafted 2 smaller ships they aptly named Deliverance and Patience. The work was grueling. With only limited tools, every piece of wood had to be carefully repurposed. Even though some didn't want to go, they worked tirelessly. For many, the mission to Jamestown began to feel more like a shared duty, and maybe their best option for long-term survival. As the months went by, the group on Bermuda grew into a close-knit, thriving community. The survivors had constructed a village of makeshift huts from scrap wood and palm fronds. They organized hunting parties of the wild pigs likely left by previous explorers, and along with the island's fruits and fish, the group managed to stay surprisingly healthy despite the unexpected circumstances. Strong bonds formed among the survivors as they faced each new challenge together. Finally, after nearly 10 months on the island, the newly built Deliverance and Patience were ready to set sail. With supplies loaded and spirits renewed, Summers and Gates led their determined group back to the open sea, bound once again for Jamestown and the promise of a new beginning. 2 weeks later, after nearly a year-long ordeal, they finally arrived at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, ready to restore this budding colony. But they were met with a scene far worse than they had expected. Jamestown wasn't just on the verge of collapse. The settlement was reduced to only a handful of starving, desperate colonists. They learned that after the Sea Venture wrecked on Bermuda, 7 of the original 9 ships in the 3rd resupply mission managed to survive the hurricane and reach Jamestown, while the Catch was lost at sea without a trace, its fate unknown to this day. However, instead of offering relief, these ships brought even greater hardships. Arriving with limited supplies and numerous sick passengers, they quickly overwhelmed Jamestown's already fragile resources without Sea Venture's large stockpile of supplies. Diseases like dysentery, yellow fever, and typhoid spread rapidly, further decimating the population. By the time Patience and Deliverance arrived in May 1610, only a few of the original 7 ships from the fleet remained docked in Jamestown. The rest had returned to alert England of the grave situation. The majority of the settlers from those early ships had either succumbed to disease and starvation or were barely surviving in foul conditions. Only around 60 of the original 500 colonists remained alive. Gates and Summers distributed the provisions they bought, but they knew these supplies wouldn't sustain the colony for long in its fragile state. Given the dire situation, Gates decided to abandon Jamestown. On June 7, 1610, the remaining colonists boarded the Deliverance, Patience, Discovery, and Virginia to set sail back to England. But just as they were departing, they encountered another English fleet led by Lord De La Warr at the mouth of the James River. This unexpected fourth resupply mission had been organized after the remainder of the original Third Fleet informed the Virginia Company of the colony's dire conditions. De La Warr and his ships had arrived with fresh supplies, additional settlers, and orders to restore and revitalize the colony. His timely arrival persuaded Gates to reverse the evacuation, and the surviving colonists returned to Jamestown under De La Warr's leadership. This last-minute intervention ultimately saved the colony from abandonment, marking a pivotal moment in its survival and allowing England to finally secure a foothold in the New World. This settlement would go on to pave the way for future English colonies and the eventual establishment of the United States. And just as the Sea Venture's ordeal became immortalized in Shakespeare's The Tempest, the legacy of Jamestown became an enduring symbol of survival, adaptation, and unshakable human spirit. Thanks for watching this episode of Edge of Survival. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible survival stories. Hope to see you in the next one.